The storm was no longer just weather. It had a voice. It had a pulse. It moved with intention, curling around the hills like a predator stalking its prey. The people of Kentucky spoke of it as if it were alive, because it was, and at its core, standing like a prophet crowned in lightning, was Elias Grayson. By now, the boy no longer resembled a boy. His skin had taken on a pallid, almost translucent hue, and those eyeless sockets seemed to drink in the light around him. When he walked, the air bent, shadows warped in unnatural directions, and animals in the woods would fall silent, trembling as though they sensed something ancient crawling through him. The storm followed wherever Elias appeared. At first, it was small, a swirl of black clouds rolling over the hills, swallowing the horizon. But it grew with each ritual, each whispered command in that alien tongue. Witnesses claimed they saw faces in the lightning, writhing expressions of agony etched in every strike. The thunder, some said, sounded like the beating of a colossal heart. The Graysons had begun their work beyond the borders of their cursed chapel. Strange symbols were found etched into the stone bridges and abandoned mills of neighboring counties. Farmers would wake to find their cattle slaughtered, their entrails arranged into spirals pointing toward Rosewater Hill. Even those who never set foot near the Graysons felt a creeping dread, as though the family's influence was seeping into their dreams, their homes, their very breath. A traveling preacher, Reverend Collins, dared to confront them. He gathered a small band of men and rode to the chapel, determined to break whatever unholy power bound the land. Only one of them returned. His face was ghost pale, his hands trembling uncontrollably as he stammered. There was no storm until we got close. Then the sky split open, and he was standing there. That boy, God forgive me, he called it. The clouds bent toward him like they were listening. I saw something crawl out of the lightning and drag Collins into the dark. The survivors began calling it the Hollow Tempest. It was no longer just a storm. It was Elias's weapon, his shield, and his messenger. And then, in the dead of winter, a letter arrived in the nearest town. It bore no stamp, no name, just the words scrawled in jagged ink. We are coming. The first family vanished on a moonless night. The Wilkes farm, a place of laughter and cattle bells, was found silent at dawn. Doors left wide open. Supper untouched on the table. Beds unmade. No signs of struggle. Just an unnatural stillness, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Only one thing was found. A spiral of ash on the floorboards, perfectly drawn, as if burned into the wood by invisible hands. People whispered that the storm had taken them, that Elias had come. They were right. By now. The Grayson family no longer moved like humans. Witnesses who caught glimpses of them in the woods described figures wrapped in dark, heavy cloth, faces hidden, hands pale and thin like bones. Elias would stand in the center, his head tilted upward, muttering in that strange, guttural language that made the air hum. Animals would collapse at the sound, as if something inside them simply gave up. The disappearances spread like wildfire. Entire households gone, tracks leading nowhere. Sometimes, neighbors would hear knocking late at night, soft at first, then frantic, followed by silence. Those who dared to investigate found their own barns burned to the ground, or their wells filled with black water that stank of our oteat. It was as if the land itself was turning against them. Crops rotted overnight. The wind carried whispers that seemed to mimic their own voices. Children would wake screaming, swearing that a boy with no eyes had stood at the foot of their beds, promising they would belong to the storm. A handful of men tried to flee with their families, but their wagons never reached the county line. One was found overturned, the horses torn apart, their entrails arranged in yet another spiral pointing back to Rosewater Hill. The men who dared approach said the trees along the path were scarred with claw-like marks, as though something monstrous had pursued them. Now, the townsfolk had a choice: submit or vanish. Some began leaving offerings at the edge of the woods, candles, bread, even locks of hair, hoping to appease the Graysons. It didn't work, because this was never about appeasement. It was about Harvest Point one night, as thunder rolled without rain, a voice was heard across the hills, deep and hollow. The storm chooses who is ready to be taken. The storm came without warning. No clouds, no rain, just a rolling wall of sound and a heat that made the earth tremble. People said it wasn't weather at all, but something alive. It was Elias. It was the Graysons calling. That night, the hunting began. They came out of the woods like shadows ripped from the ground. Elias walked first, bare feet leaving blackened prints that sizzled against the dirt. Behind him, his sisters moved in perfect unison, their heads covered, whispering in a language that made even the bravest men clutch their throats. The air grew heavy, and with each breath, it felt like swallowing ashes. One farmer swore he saw Elias lift his hand toward a fleeing man, and the man simply froze, his body snapping backward as if dragged by unseen ropes. His screams were cut short, swallowed by the wind, leaving only the faint sound of something tearing. When they found his body days later, his eyes were missing, replaced with stones polished smooth like river glass. The townsfolk, finally pushed beyond fear, decided to fight. They gathered in secret, whispering names of old protectors, angels, saints, spirits forgotten by the church. An old woman, Miriam Hale, claimed she remembered the old rites her grandmother taught her, the kind of rites that came before the Bible. She spoke of circles drawn with blood, of salt and fire, of words you must not mispronounce, so they tried. They built fires at the edge of the fields, chanting until their voices cracked. They carved symbols into their doors and left knives under their pillows. But it was like throwing stones at a flood. Elias seemed amused by their resistance. More animals were found gutted, their organs arranged in patterns that mirrored the marks the townsfolk had carved on their doors, as if to mock them. One night, the Graysons appeared at the church steps, silently watching from the dark, their pale faces glowing in the moonlight. When the preacher dared to shout a prayer at them, his voice faltered, and he fell to his knees, coughing up black water. Miriam Hale warned them, "This isn't a family. It's a covenant. They're bound to something that feeds on fear, and we've been feeding it for years." The disappearances doubled. Families locked their doors, but the storm always found a way in. Windows shattered, candles blew out, and in the dark, the voice of Elias would whisper, low and patient, "You cannot fight what you've already welcomed." The town was on the edge of breaking. Miriam Hale, hunched and brittle but sharp-eyed as a crow, became their last hope. She spoke of something older than Scripture, a fire buried under the roots of the world, a power that could sever the Graysons' bond. But she warned them, this ritual demanded a price. Someone had to be the anchor. Someone had to bleed for the town. She drew a circle in the dirt outside the church, its lines cut deep and filled with salt mixed with the ashes of burned wheat. "This isn't prayer," she hissed at the gathering crowd. "This is a trade. We call on something older, something they fear. If you lose your nerve, it'll take you instead." The ritual began at dusk. The townsfolk gathered around, their voices trembling as they repeated the words Miriam spoke. The air grew thick, heavy, as though the ground itself had begun to breathe. Flames rose high from the fires, twisting into shapes that looked like faces, faces screaming without sound. But the Graysons came. Elias appeared at the edge of the circle, smiling as though amused by a child's tantrum. His sisters followed, their pale eyes reflecting the firelight. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The wind bent toward them, and with a single glance, half the candles blew out, that Miriam's voice grew louder, harsher. Blood trickled from her nose as she shouted words that tasted like iron. The ground shook. The sky darkened. For the first time, Elias frowned. His sisters stepped back, their lips curling into silent snarls. Something was coming, something even they didn't want to face. Then, without warning, one of the townsfolk broke. A young man, terrified by the growing storm, stepped out of the circle. "I can't. This isn't right," he screamed. Elias raised his hand. The boy's body snapped like kindling, bones splintering under invisible force. His lifeless corpse was hurled into the flames, and the fire roared black. The circle broke. Miriam collapsed, her body twitching as if something inside her was trying to claw its way out. The Graysons stepped forward, unhurried, savoring the terror. Elias knelt by the dying woman and whispered something that made her eyes go wide with horror. Then she went still, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. When dawn came, the town square was empty, save for the blackened circle of salt and the smell of burned flesh. The night after Miriam's death, something changed in the air. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was resignation. The townsfolk had seen what defiance brought. The Graysons had made their message clear. Survival was no longer a matter of will, but of submission. By morning, Elias called them all to the center of town. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His presence alone bent every spine and crushed every whisper. With his sisters standing like pale statues behind him, Elias declared what he called the blood tithe. From this day, he said, his voice calm but soaked with venom, one of you will be chosen each season, not as a sacrifice, but as an offering, a mark of respect. Fail to offer, and I will take 10. His words hung in the air like iron chains. No one spoke. No one dared. The first offering came that night. A farmer's wife, dragged from her home by her own husband because he believed it was better her than all of them. They brought her to the old church where the Graysons waited. No one saw what happened inside. But when dawn broke, the doors creaked open, and all that remained was a trail of blood that led into the woods. And yet, the crops flourished the next week. The sick were suddenly well. Rain fell gently across their fields. It was as though the land itself had been blessed. Elias walked among them like a dark priest, smiling faintly as he watched them reap what they thought was a reward. But deep down, everyone knew it wasn't blessing. It was a leash. The sisters began visiting homes at night, silent as death. They would stand in the doorways, watching, as though selecting who might be next. Sometimes they spoke to the children, whispering in voices too soft to hear. And by morning, those children would be changed, pale, distant, speaking in riddles as if the Graysons had planted seeds in their minds. Whispers spread. Were the offerings keep? Something worse at bay? Or were they feeding it? One night, as the town gathered to discuss escape, they discovered the doors to every house had been nailed shut from the outside. No one knew when it had been done. No one saw who did it. But every soul in Hollow Creek understood the truth. They weren't a town anymore. They were a cage. The first ember of rebellion did not come from strength. It came from desperation. Silas Rook, a blacksmith's apprentice, was the first to whisper aloud what many were too afraid to think. If they bleed, they can die. His words were spoken in the shadows of an empty barn, with only 3 others present, men who had lost children, wives, brothers to the offerings. The grief in their eyes burned hotter than fear. Silas believed the Graysons weren't gods. He'd seen Elias' hand brush against a hot iron rod once, and though the man didn't cry out, there was the faint scent of burned flesh. It was enough to convince Silas that the Graysons could be hurt. And if they could be hurt, they could be killed. Their plan was simple: strike while the Graysons slept. But as they spoke, an unease hung over the barn, like the walls themselves were listening. It wasn't just paranoia. Every time the Graysons were mentioned, a strange sound would echo in the wind. A low hum, like the vibration of distant chanting. 2 nights later, Silas made his move. He approached the old church, armed with a sledgehammer and iron stakes. His hands trembled, but rage fueled every breath. He forced open the door and stepped inside. What he saw was not sleep. The Graysons stood in a circle around the altar, their heads bowed, their lips moving in a language that sounded older than the earth. In the center of the altar lay the remains of the farmer's wife, bones neatly arranged, her skull split open as though something had fed from inside. The sisters turned to face him in unison, their eyes black as pitch, their mouths twisting into something between a smile and a snarl. Silas swung his hammer. He struck Sarah in the side of the head. It connected with a sickening crack, and she fell. For a single breath, hope filled him. She wasn't invincible. But then, she rose. The wound in her skull didn't bleed. It simply closed like melting wax. She tilted her head, almost curious, and whispered something in a voice that wasn't hers, a voice that sounded like the earth groaning. The next morning, Silas' body was found hanging from the steeple of the church, his eyes gouged out, his jaw sewn shut with twine. A message was carved into his chest. You cannot kill what was never alive. After Silas' death, no one spoke of rebellion again. His body was left hanging for 3 days. A warning, the church bells ringing hollow every dawn as if marking the hours of damnation. But on the 4th night, the Graysons summoned the town. Every man, woman, and child was herded into the church. No one dared defy them. The pews creaked beneath trembling bodies. The smell of candle wax and blood-soaked was heavy in the air. Elias stood at the altar, silent for what felt like an eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't human. It rolled through the room like a storm, vibrating in the bones, making even the strongest men clutch their chests. You still do not understand, he said. You think we demand your offerings because we want them. You think we are gods, devils, or monsters. We're none of these things. We are gatekeepers. Sarah stepped forward, her pale fingers trailing along the altar, leaving faint streaks of blood where she touched. There is something beneath this land. It is older than the world. We serve it because we must. Every life you give keeps it sleeping. Every drop of blood feeds its hunger. If you refuse, it will wake. The youngest Grayson sister, Miriam, smiled like a child sharing a secret. Would you like to see what happens when it wakes? She raised her hand, and the candles went out. The church fell into a darkness so deep it felt alive, swallowing the breath of every soul inside. Then came the sound, a low rumbling beneath the floorboards, like something massive shifting beneath the earth. The walls groaned, the ceiling cracked, and a foul, sulfuric stench filled the room. Through the blackness, a shape seemed to press up from beneath the wooden floor. A hand, or what looked like one, stretching long fingers, nails like jagged stone, clawing toward the surface. Screams erupted, and then the candles returned. The shape was gone, but the warning was not. Elias leaned forward, his eyes like pits of tar. The blood we take spares you from its jaws. You will give it freely, or we will take it. There is no other path. The town understood then. The Graysons were not just monsters. They were jailers of something worse. It happened on the coldest night of the year, when the river froze solid and the moon bled red through a veil of thin clouds. The people of Ashford Hollow had endured too much, too many screams, too many missing faces, too many nights where the sound of digging in the woods haunted their dreams. The Graysons' warning no longer inspired fear. It inspired fury. Led by Thomas Hale, the blacksmith whose wife had vanished 2 winters ago, the townsfolk gathered in silence, armed with axes, lanterns, and whatever courage they could scrape together. They would end this curse, burn the Graysons' manor, destroy every trace of them. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they ascended the hill. The manor loomed above, its windows glowing like the eyes of a predator. But as they neared the gates, the air grew heavy, as if the world itself resisted them. Lantern flames bent sideways, whispering with invisible winds. The earth trembled, not violently, but enough to make the weak-hearted hesitate. Inside the manor, Elias was waiting. He stood at the front doors, shirtless despite the cold, his pale skin marked with symbols carved into his flesh. Behind him, Sarah and Miriam knelt, chanting in a language that clawed at the mind. You think fire can kill us? Elias said. His tone was almost mocking. You think we built this house for us? No, this place is not ours. It's its. Thomas raised his axe, his voice breaking from rage and terror. We're done giving you blood. We'll die before we give you another child. Elias smiled, and the ground split. From the hill below, the townsfolk saw it, cracks racing through the snow like black lightning, steam and sulfur rising from beneath the frozen earth. A noise erupted from deep underground, not a growl, not a roar, but something so alien it made every soul wish for death rather than understanding. Then the house began to sink. The Graysons did not run. They didn't even scream. Elias raised his hands, chanting louder, as if inviting whatever slept below to claim him. The townsfolk fled, dropping their weapons, stumbling over each other in the snow. Some never made it back. When the sun rose, the manor was gone. Only a crater remained, smoking like the aftermath of a funeral pyre. But at night, some swear they still hear the church bells, and sometimes they say the ground still breathes.